My name is Vanessa Okoye. I'm 34 years old, and 5 weeks ago, at our family reunion in a rented pavilion outside Charlotte, North Carolina, my father stood up in front of nearly 50 relatives and said, loudly enough for the whole picnic to hear, "Vanessa's going nowhere with her life, still stuck in that boring desk job nobody can even explain." 2 minutes later, two of my actual colleagues, who I'd texted my location to that morning out of habit, walked up to our table to hand deliver a secure document I needed to review before Monday, and my father watched both of their government identification badges catch the afternoon sun before either of them said a single word. I didn't plan for that moment to happen the way it did. I just watched my father's face change in real time, and I finished my potato salad while he tried to figure out what to say next. To understand why that moment landed the way it did, you need to go back 11 years, to the week I accepted a job I've never been able to fully explain at a single family dinner since. Before I get into it, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop the word underestimated in the comments if your family's ever measured your worth by how much they understood about your job. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need the full picture before any of what happened at that reunion makes sense. I work as an intelligence analyst for a federal agency, a job I can describe to my family only in the broadest possible terms, which has been for 11 years both a professional necessity and a strange, ongoing source of family tension I never fully anticipated when I accepted the position. I can tell people honestly that I work a desk job for the federal government analyzing information, which is true, and which sounds, to almost everyone who's never worked in this world, unbearably dull. I can't tell them which agency, specifics of what I analyze, or almost anything about my actual day-to-day work, not because I'm being secretive for its own sake, but because the position requires a security clearance with real, legally binding confidentiality obligations that I take seriously, the same way any professional takes their ethical obligations seriously. There are entire categories of ordinary conversation. What did you work on this week? Was work interesting lately? What's the most memorable thing that's happened on the job that I simply cannot participate in the way most people can? And I've spent 11 years developing a kind of practiced vagueness that, I've come to understand, reads very differently to people who don't know its cause than it feels from the inside. I grew up the second of 3 children, with my older brother Desmond and my younger sister Camille, in a family where my father Harold spent 30 years as a mid-level manager at a manufacturing plant, proud, hardworking, and, I think, genuinely confused for most of my adult life about what exactly I do for a living. Our childhood was ordinary in most respects, modest but comfortable, my father working long hours, and my mother filling most of the emotional and logistical labor of raising 3 kids on a manufacturing manager's salary. I remember him coming home most evenings still smelling faintly of the plant floor, tired but proud of a day's tangible output, boxes shipped, quotas met, numbers he could point to on a report. My mother passed when I was 26, a loss that reshaped our family's dynamics in ways none of us fully anticipated, and in the years since, my father's opinions about each of his children's careers have hardened into something closer to fixed, unquestioned belief than ongoing observation. Desmond became a successful contractor, building custom homes across the region, something my father can point to, literally, driving past finished houses with visible pride, mentioning at every gathering which family now lives in a home Desmond built with his own crew. Camille works as a pediatric nurse, a profession that requires no explanation to anyone at a dinner table, her long shifts and difficult cases understood instantly by anyone who's ever needed a nurse's care. My work, by contrast, has always been the family's ongoing, slightly uncomfortable mystery, the daughter with the job nobody could quite picture, doing something at a desk somewhere that never produced anything anyone could point to or drive past. I accepted the analyst position 11 years ago, in my early 20s, after a winding path through a political science degree and a graduate program in international affairs that had, itself, been treated at family gatherings as a slightly impractical, overly academic choice compared to Desmond's hands-on trade apprenticeship or Camille's straightforward path through nursing school. I remember my father, at my graduate school graduation, asking half-jokingly what exactly I planned to do with all that theory, a question that stung more than I let on at the time, standing there in cap and gown, surrounded by classmates whose families seemed to understand instinctively what their degrees would translate into. When I finally told my family I'd accepted a federal position, I remember my father asking, genuinely, what exactly the job involved, and me explaining, honestly, that I couldn't share many specifics, that it involved analysis work supporting national security functions, and that this vagueness was simply a permanent condition of the job rather than evasiveness on my part. I watched something in his expression settle, that day, into a kind of polite disbelief that never fully lifted over the following decade. The sense, I think, that if I really had an important job, I'd surely be able to describe it more impressively than, I analyze information and can't tell you what kind. Over the following 11 years, that unresolved confusion calcified, slowly, into something closer to quiet dismissal. My father developed a habit at family gatherings of describing my career in vague, faintly diminishing terms: government paperwork, some kind of desk thing in Washington, phrases that technically weren't inaccurate, but that consistently stripped away any sense that the work might be significant. I never corrected him with specifics because I couldn't, and over time I think the absence of specifics simply got filled in, by him and eventually by other relatives, with an assumption that there was nothing particularly impressive to specify in the first place, that my vagueness reflected a lack of substance rather than a genuine confidentiality requirement. I remember more than once watching a distant cousin's eyes glaze over the moment I mentioned federal analysis work, visibly deciding there was nothing more interesting to ask about, moving on to someone whose job came with an easier, more satisfying story attached. I want to be honest that this dynamic wore on me more than I let on for most of those 11 years. I watched Desmond get asked detailed, admiring questions about his latest construction project at every single holiday, relatives leaning in as he described load-bearing calculations and custom finishes with obvious pride. I watched Camille receive warm, specific praise for a difficult shift she'd worked at the children's hospital, our aunts asking follow-up questions, genuinely moved by her stories. I got, at best, a polite change of subject, and at worst, comments like the one at that reunion, delivered with enough casual confidence that correcting them publicly, without violating actual security protocols, never felt like a real option. I built, over those years, a kind of professional stoicism about it, telling myself that the work itself mattered more than whether my family understood it, though I'll admit now that the stoicism sometimes felt thinner than I let anyone see. The reunion itself, 5 weeks ago, was a large, sprawling gathering, nearly 50 relatives from both sides of my extended family, rented pavilions and folding tables spread across a state park outside Charlotte, the kind of event that happens every 3 years and draws people back from across the country. I'd driven up from Washington that morning, planning to stay through the weekend, genuinely looking forward to seeing cousins I hadn't seen in years, catching up over barbecue and the specific, comfortable chaos of a large extended family reunion, kids running between tables, someone's speaker playing music too loud, the smell of charcoal smoke drifting across the pavilion. My father's comment came about 2 hours into the gathering, during a lull in conversation at the main table, where he'd been holding court about Desmond's newest custom home project, a large, impressive build he'd recently completed for a well-known local family, complete with photos he'd pulled up on his phone to pass around the table. Someone, an aunt I hadn't seen in years, asked politely what I was up to these days, and before I could answer, my father cut in, with the easy confidence of someone repeating a story he'd told many times before. Vanessa's going nowhere with her life, still stuck in that boring desk job nobody can even explain. At least Desmond's got something to show for his work. A few relatives laughed, uncomfortably, the way people do when a comment lands harder than the speaker seems to realize. My aunt glanced at me with a slightly apologetic expression, unsure whether to press further or let the moment pass. I didn't say anything immediately. I'd heard some version of this comment enough times over the years that a familiar, practiced calm settled over me almost automatically, the same calm I use walking into difficult professional briefings. I picked up my fork and continued eating my potato salad, genuinely unsure in that moment whether I'd say anything at all. What happened next wasn't something I orchestrated, though I understand why from the outside it might look that way. I'd texted my location to two colleagues that morning, Marcus and Devora, both analysts on my team, because we'd arranged before I left for the reunion that they'd drive up separately that weekend to hand-deliver a secure document requiring my physical signature before a Monday morning deadline, a routine procedural requirement for certain classified materials that can't simply be emailed, even between colleagues with equivalent clearances. This kind of in-person document handoff happens more often than people would guess, an unglamorous, entirely bureaucratic necessity of the job that has nothing to do with anything dramatic, despite how it might look walking up to a family picnic. I remember, honestly, being mildly annoyed that morning that the handoff had to happen during my one weekend off in months. Texting Marcus my location with a slightly exasperated, "See you around too," that I never imagined would coincide with anything more than an inconvenient interruption to a plate of barbecue. Marcus and Devora arrived at the pavilion almost exactly as my father finished his sentence, both still in the plain, unremarkable business clothes they'd worn for the drive, government identification badges clipped visibly to their jacket pockets out of habit, the way you clip them on without thinking after years of routine building access. They looked, if anything, faintly out of place among the picnic tables and coolers, two people in business casual navigating around lawn chairs, and a bounce house someone had set up for the younger kids. Marcus approached the table, glanced briefly at the gathered relatives with polite uncertainty, clearly sensing he'd interrupted something without knowing what, and said simply, "Vanessa, sorry to interrupt, we've got the document for you. Whenever you have a few minutes." I want to describe my father's face in that moment because I think it matters. It wasn't shock exactly, not immediately. It was something closer to a slow, visible recalculation, his eyes moving from Marcus's badge to Devora's, then back to me, processing information that didn't fit cleanly into the story he'd just finished telling. My aunt, the one who'd asked the original question, looked between all of us with open curiosity. My cousin Renata, sitting a few seats down, later told me she'd nearly laughed out loud at the timing, catching herself only because the moment felt too charged for humor. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The pavilion's ordinary background noise, kids shouting, someone's radio, the sizzle of the grill, suddenly feeling very loud against the silence at our table. I stood up calmly and said, "Give me a few minutes, I'll come sign it." I walked with Marcus and Devora to a quieter spot near the parking area, past a group of younger cousins tossing a football, reviewed and signed the document, a routine 15-minute procedural matter that involved nothing more dramatic than my signature and a brief verification of my identification, and then walked back to the pavilion, where the conversation at the main table had noticeably shifted in my absence. Marcus, before driving off, told me quietly, "Sorry if that was awkward timing." And I told him honestly that the timing had actually mattered more than he could have known. My father was quieter when I returned, though he tried, initially, to recover the previous tone. "Everything all right?" he asked, a little too casually. I told him it was, that it was just a routine work matter, careful, as always, not to say more than I was permitted to. He didn't push for details, which surprised me slightly, though I understood, watching his expression, that something had shifted in how he was processing the last several minutes. My cousin Renata, who'd been sitting nearby the whole time, leaned over to me later that afternoon and said quietly, "I don't think your dad's ever seen actual federal ID badges show up in person like that. I think it kind of recalibrated something for him, watching it happen instead of just hearing you describe it." I appreciated her noticing, though I told her honestly that I hadn't engineered the moment, that it was simply an unusually visible coincidence of ordinary work logistics colliding with an ordinary, if hurtful, family comment. I didn't confront my father directly that day. I want to be honest about why. 11 years of practiced restraint isn't something that unwinds in a single afternoon, and I genuinely wasn't looking for a dramatic reckoning at a family reunion in front of 50 relatives over a comment I'd absorbed dozens of times before. What I did notice, over the remaining 2 days of the gathering, was a subtle, unmistakable shift in how my father spoke about me to other relatives. No longer the dismissive, desk job nobody can explain, but something closer to careful, almost hesitant respect, the tone of someone recalibrating an old assumption in real time without quite knowing how to say so directly. He finally raised it himself, on the drive to the airport at the end of the weekend, offering to take me himself rather than letting me call a rideshare, something he'd never once offered to do at any of the previous reunions. About 20 minutes into the drive, the radio turned down low, he said, without much preamble. "I've been saying that job of yours doesn't amount to much for years, haven't I? I think I said it again at the picnic, actually, right before your colleagues showed up." I told him honestly that yes, he had, more times than I could count over the past decade, and that I'd stopped expecting it to change, which was, I think, harder for him to hear than the original comment itself. "I think," he said slowly, eyes still on the road, "I built a story in my head a long time ago, because I genuinely couldn't picture what you actually did, and it felt easier to assume there wasn't much to picture than to sit with not understanding my own daughter's career. Watching those two show up like that, badges and all, quiet and professional, it made me realize I've been filling in the blanks with the wrong story for 11 years. I think some part of me needed your job to be small, because if it wasn't small, then I'd spent a decade being genuinely wrong about my own kid. And that's a harder thing to sit with than just repeating the same joke every few years." I told him I appreciated him saying that, and that I understood in a way why the not knowing had been hard for him. I'd chosen a profession that required me to withhold almost everything specific, and I recognized that this asked something genuinely difficult of the people who loved me, a kind of trust without evidence that not everyone finds easy to sustain over a decade. I told him, too, that I understood Desmond and Camille's careers were simply easier to hold in your hands, easier to picture, and that I'd never really expected mine to compete with that on the same terms. He was quiet for a while after that, navigating traffic near the airport exit, before he said one more thing that stayed with me the rest of the flight home. "I think I owe your brother and sister a version of this conversation, too, honestly. I don't think I've ever really asked either of them what their work actually feels like, day to day, past the parts I can already picture. I think I've been coasting on what's easy to understand, instead of actually asking any of my kids the harder questions." I told him that sounded like a good instinct, and that I hoped he'd follow through on it, not just with me. 5 weeks have passed since that reunion. My father has started asking different kinds of questions since then, not for specifics I still can't share, but broader, more respectful questions about the shape of my career, whether I find the work meaningful, whether it's difficult being unable to discuss most of my day with the people closest to me. They're small questions, but they represent a genuine shift from years of assumption toward actual curiosity. And I've noticed myself, in turn, being more willing to share the general contours of my professional life, the parts I safely can. Desmond called me about 2 weeks after the reunion, having heard the story secondhand from our cousin Renata, and said something that stayed with me. I never really thought about how it must feel, watching me get asked about every house I build in detail, while you just get the desk job. I think I got used to being the one people understood, and I didn't think much about what that meant for you. I appreciated him saying that, more than I let on in the moment. He told me, too, that he'd started describing my work differently to his own kids, telling them their aunt does something really important for the country, even if she can't tell us exactly what. A small shift in language that meant more to me than he probably realized when he mentioned it. Camille called a few days after that, apologizing for something I hadn't even fully registered as hurtful at the time, a habit she'd had, for years, of steering conversation away from my work at family gatherings whenever it came up. Not out of malice, she explained, but because she genuinely hadn't known what to ask and didn't want to make me uncomfortable by pressing on something private. I think I mistook not knowing what to ask for not being interested, she said. That's not fair to you, and I'm sorry it took Dad's whole scene at the picnic for me to think about it directly. I think about that reunion sometimes, my father's face shifting as Marcus and Devora's badges caught the afternoon light. I don't feel triumphant remembering it, even though something clearly changed that day. I feel mostly a kind of quiet, complicated relief. Not that my father was embarrassed, which was never something I wanted, but that 11 years of an unexplainable gap in understanding finally had a small, ordinary crack of light let into it, entirely by accident, through nothing more dramatic than a routine document delivery arriving at an inconvenient moment. I've thought, too, about how much of this entire dynamic depended on something I couldn't control, the confidentiality requirements of a job I chose because I believed in the work, not because I wanted a decade of family tension attached to it. I don't regret the career. I've done work over these 11 years that I'm genuinely proud of, even if pride in this field mostly stays private, unspoken, known only to the small circle of colleagues who understand exactly what a good day at this job actually looks like. What I've come to understand more clearly in the 5 weeks since that reunion is that I'm allowed to want my family's respect even without being able to earn it through explanation, and that it's not selfish or unreasonable to feel the absence of that respect over the years, even while accepting that the confidentiality itself was never negotiable. If you're watching this and your family has ever filled the gaps in what they don't understand about you with the least generous possible story, I want you to hear this, because I spent 11 years believing that silence about the specifics meant I also had to stay silent about how much the assumption hurt. You don't owe anyone details you're not able to share, but sometimes, even without a single word of explanation, the truth finds its own quiet way of showing up exactly when it needs to, badges and all, whether you planned for it or not. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a time your family misunderstood what you actually do, and what it took for them to finally see it clearly. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a woman whose brother called her job a hobby that doesn't pay real bills. 3 weeks before her name appeared on the cover of a national business magazine, he happened to be reading in a waiting room.